Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this will be an amazing episode. You will never forget it. So once you see it, you'll never be able to unsee it. Paul is trapped in a contradiction in 1 Corinthians. He is not under the law, 1 Corinthians 9:20, but all women are still under the law that requires obedience to not speak in church, 1 Corinthians 14:34. So Paul says on the left side, women are under the law in 1 Corinthians 14:34. And on the right side, he says he's not under the law, 1 Corinthians 9:19-23. This is amazing stuff. How can he be not under the law, but women are under the law? And that means he's contradicting himself. So normally you would conclude he's lying. So if that's the only conclusion you can come up with, and we'll discuss if there's any other conclusion, is then if he's lying, he cannot be speaking for God, because in Numbers 23:19, God says, I'm not a human that I should lie. So let's begin. You'll find this, I think, very interesting. First of all, let's read through these passages. I'm going to go through a commentary by Ellicott. You'll see down here he has a detailed comment on each one of these. I'm going to show you how clear it is in his commentary. And he's a very pro-Paul person and very antinomian, very anti-God's law. 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34, King James. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also says the law. There is no such law, by the way, in the law of Moses, but it's on the it's on the wall at Delphi. Okay, but we're just going to go with it. He said the law, and he means nomos. He means God's law. 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19-23. Paul is going to explain how he can pretend to be one thing when he really isn't under the law to win people who believe the law still applies, and he can pretend that he has no law applicable to him at all, even though he has some ethical mores to the law of Christ, which he doesn't describe. So let's listen to what he says. 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19-23, NIV. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. This is a very familiar rule in pagan religion. Homer's Odyssey, basically the gods there all justify lying in order to persuade people to follow their who they are and be obedient to them. Verse 20, to the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law. So there's something called Christ's law. He doesn't describe it exactly, but he does say multiple times. He says, not all things are expedient. And so those things are inexpedient, where the costs outweigh the benefit. He won't do those things. That's what he said. All things are lawful, but not all things are expedient. So he'll, for expedience sake, he won't do certain things that, he thinks are going to be embarrassing or cost too much, credit with other people. And he'll just avoid that just for their sake, not for his own. Let's continue. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. So to go after the Gentiles, he's going to pretend to be completely without law, even though he has this thing called the Christ law, whatever that may be. Verse 22, to the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. Jesus basically, by the way, said anyone who tries to please all people is what? I don't even want to tell you what Jesus said about that. A people pleaser is condemned by Jesus uncategorically. Verse 23, I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in this blessing. And this blessing is what? To win souls through hypocrisy. That's not anything you can hide about any of this. Okay. But now what we have is not the fact that he defends hypocrisy for the sake of the gospel, which he also says in Romans 3:7. What we have here is clearly a contradiction, because a woman is subject to the law, but he is not under the law. Now, how can that be? Let's take a look. All right. So we're going to look at an extreme pro-Paul fan, Charles John Ellicott, an English theologian and Anglican bishop who wrote a well-known Bible commentary. He was born in England in 1819, graduated St. John's College, Cambridge, became a fellow of St. John's College. He was all kinds of religious officers in Protestant churches. And there was a picture of him. Here's the title of this slide. Ellicott says Paul's application of the law, the Torah, which includes Genesis, removes the law's inferiority of women to men and no longer is inferior to her husband. So I don't know if you've thought about this, is if Paul abrogated the law, then the law included Genesis. Remember, we showed you 3:16. Some people say that means uh, Eve's punishment by God, that she was now subject to the rule of her husband, is something that actually extends to all her progeny, even though it doesn't say that. Okay, and the Eastern Orthodox is very strict and say it doesn't say that. It's just the punishment on Eve. But Augustine, for the Roman Catholic Church, said no, it's an original type sin, even though Paul doesn't use those terms, and it imputes this to all the progeny of Eve, that they're all subject to the rule of men. Even though, again, the Eastern Orthodox rejects that, saying no, it's a punishment only on Eve. So, but my point here is that Ellicott avoids the whole problem by saying Paul abrogated the entire law, so now women are equal. Now, let me show you that quote. We have to move on a little bit over here. This is where he says that. This is in 1878, New Testament commentary for English readers. In Christ, the whole penalty, as St. Paul teaches, has been abrogated, Galatians 3:28. And the Christian woman is no more inferior to the man than is the Gentile to the Jew or the bondman to the free. So whatever consequence happened in the fall was erased when the law was abrogated, and the Genesis statement is in the law. So that's gone, and everything's gone, and all's good again, and there is no inferiority of women. See what he says here? The Christian woman is no more inferior to the man than is the Gentile to the Jew or the bondman to the be free. See? And this is Ellicott. Now we're going to go back. This is 1878. Now he's going to say something different 9 years later. Take a look. All right. So 9 years later, 1887, he simply shows it's a contradiction. He doesn't try to tell you it's a contradiction, but he just tells you each passage is what they mean. And it's a contradiction, and he leaves it the way it is. He doesn't try to explain why it's contradictory. So let's listen to what he says. Now, this is in a book he called St. Paul's First Epistle to the Corinthians. So you couldn't find more of a better book, where he totally goes in great detail on every passage, every line, goes deeply into the Greek, and explains everything. Okay, so you cannot miss it, that he covers every single topic. And he subtitles it with a critical and grammatical commentary, 1887, Charles J. Elliott, Doctor of Divinity. Excuse me, Ellicott. Charles J. Ellicott. Let's listen. Now, this is up here is XIV, meaning chapter 14, and verse 34 is what we're looking at. So this is the heading, and it's page 283 of the book. It'll be in my public domain list if you have that access to that. I'll put another list link to that in the description to this video, so you can download this book yourself and read what I'm screenshotting here. Then it's reading here, and this is the word nomos right here, as the law also says. So it's the law. And then he says in the primal declaration, Genesis 3:16, it says this. Now, what is he doing here? This is 9 years later. He's going back against what he had already said before, is the law is dead and gone, and that's why she's no longer subject to this, and she's not inferior. 9 years later, he's going to try to explain why Paul is saying, even though the law has been abrogated, right? Right? Paul is saying, no, she's under the law. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. So he's realizing, I think at this point, 9 years later, that, oops, Paul says women are still under the law. The men are free of the law over here. I'm a man. I'm 1 Corinthians 9. I'm not under the law, but she's under the law. And so he's going to tell you what the law is, because the only thing he can find is Genesis 3:16. And it still doesn't say a woman is commanded to be silent in church, for it is not permitted unto them to speak. Women are not permitted to speak in church. And that's for they're commanded to be under obedience, as also says the law. Obedience to what? All right, so let's just keep reading what he says. So, nomos, as the law also says in the primal declaration of Genesis 3, verse 16, thy desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over thee. And remember, Eastern Orthodox point out, this doesn't say anything about her progeny. This is a punishment on her for having made this decision alone without her husband to eat the food and then offer it to him. But she's deceived. He deliberately eats it wrong. He knows it's wrong. He was the one given the command. She wasn't even created by God yet. So she had to rely upon her husband's report about this fruit. So she, was deceived by the serpent. But he wasn't deceived. He did it deliberately. He knew it was wrong, and he did it. So the worst sinner between the two of them has to be the man, as I pointed out in the prior episode. But what he's saying here is that this, Ellicott is saying, see, he, the man, is to rule over the woman. So that's all he can cite, but it doesn't match what Paul is saying here. It doesn't say that she's under obedience to a command that she has to be silent in the law. Where is that? That's not in the law. Just because even if your husband had a rule over you, you might have a husband who is lenient and doesn't require any silence in church. So this is not making any sense. The way Ellicott is defended, Paul's statement does not support what Paul says. Genesis 3:16 does not support. There's a command that a woman must keep silent in churches because she's not permitted to speak, and that she's under command to be under obedience. Because even if that meant her husband, we don't know what each individual husband has decided, if she can speak or not speak in church, right? So he must be inferring a general command or law that the woman cannot speak in church. And I've shown you before, the only place that this law actually exists is at the Delphic Oracle. And let's just review that real quick. All right. In this web page called the Delphi Maxims, put out by a vacation planner, he basically wants to get you to go to the Delphic forum, and you'll see the walls, and you'll be able to read the maxims, and they're in Greek. So he has a definition of what they say, so you can be prepared. So we're going to look at maxims 27, 52, and 53. There's 100 and some odd maxims, and the first one is rule your wife. Could be guide your wife, advise your wife, but rule your wife is the first rule in this list of I'm listing out here. 27, 52, exercise religious silence. Okay, there's this idea that you have to be silent in the temples. And then 53, be religiously silent. So there's this a concept in paganism that you had to be hush hush in church. And so rule your wife and be silent in church is right here. That's the only place you'll find these principles exist anywhere. They're not in the law of Torah anywhere. Okay? And that's definitely what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 14:34. The women must be silent in the church, for it is not permitted to them to speak, but they must be in submission, just as the law also says. And it does not say they have to submit by being silent in church. That is a made-up statement, except Paul is looking in his own mind and memory. It's right here in the Delphic Oracle. And he lived in Tarsus, inside the province of Cilicia, which is probably a 2-week walk, or maybe a short few days by horse to get over to the Delphic Oracle. And that would be a pilgrimage almost everybody would make, because she was when he was a non-Christian. Okay, when he was non-Christian, he obviously would have followed through on going to see the most famous person of all in Europe. The most famous religious figure is the Delphic Oracle. But just to remind you, it's a woman who has no name. Nobody knows her name. And there's 3 women who cycle it every year at the same time. They all share the burden, and they just speak in glossalia. They writhe on the floor in a trance, and then the priest, such as Plutarch, who was a priest in the late hundreds, he would then interpret her and write it out on a piece of paper, and the customer who wanted the prophecy would pay money, and then the paper would be handed over, and they would have their Delphic Oracle in their hands. And this was a religious institution, and this woman was famous for centuries. So this went all the way on from the 500 BCs all the way into the time of Constantine, when he replanted the Delphic Oracle at Constantinople. And this was in 327, 2 years after Nicaea. So, by the way, proof positive he's a pagan. Never changed from being a pagan. He was still a pagan. And why would you bring the Delphic Oracle there? And that Delphic Oracle, by the way, was serving the god of the sun, Apollo, in Greek religion. And if you didn't know it, Constantine in his death coin, which is consecration coin of 337, this is 12 years after Nicaea, it shows that he is Apollo in Greek, or Sol Invictus in Latin, same figure, god of the sun. So he again proved positive he was always a pagan, never turned into a Christian. That's a big fat fabrication. Anyway, here we have it. This is where Paul's getting it from. There's no other law other than here at the Delphic Oracle that has the same principles that Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 14:34. Let's go back. Okay, now I want to show you there is a way to reconcile these things, but I think you'll find this even stranger than it would be better just to believe that he had a contradiction rather than accept what I show you next. Paul has actually a different message of salvation for women than men. Women are saved in a totally different way. They're under the law of doing good works and childbearing, and that's how they get saved. They don't get saved by like us men. Men, we just have to believe in the facts of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. But what do the women have to do? 1 Timothy 2:15. Notwithstanding, she shall be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith and charity and holiness with sobriety. That's how your wife gets saved, but that's how any woman gets saved. Wow. So the men, we're the only ones who get this freedom to just go ignore all God's law, all principles of right and wrong, and we don't have to do charity, we don't have to do holiness, we don't have to have sobriety, we can drink and be drunk. We have all the freedom in the world, but the women, no. They have to have a child, and they have to have faith and charity and holiness with sobriety. He had two different programs for salvation for women. So now let's look at it that way. Now, first of all, it doesn't fix the problem of 1 Corinthians 14. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, for they are commanded to be under obedience also under obedience, as also says the law. Well, the law doesn't say that. So this doesn't really solve that. But it does make you realize he is treating the Delphic Oracle as a new law that applies to women, and he's made it a part of our Bible. He's basically written a rule that goes into our Bible that comes right off the wall of the Delphic Oracle. No place else, my friends. No place else. You won't find it in any Hebraic source. Even Ellicott couldn't find it. This is all he could find. He found this. Okay. Try to argue from Genesis 3:16. And this guy's a genius. I mean, he knows everything you can imagine. The detail in which he was trying to defend everything he could find of Paul was amazing. But this is the best he could do. Anyway, so, but this doesn't solve it. So he doesn't, just knowing that Paul has two different gospels for men and women isn't the solution here, because you still have the problem, where is this law coming from? And he's using pagans, right? He's using pagan rules. Then over here, he says, I'm not under the law. Okay. So since he's not under the law, he he can be I'm just going to have a principle, all things are lawful, but not all things are expedient. So I have a very loosey-goosey law of Christ, which I can do anything I want, basically, unless the cost outweighs the benefit. So his law that he does have, he's tethered to slightly here at the end. He says, I'm under Christ's law, whatever that may be, still means he's not under the law. So, but he's put the woman under the law. This is the incongruity that really doesn't go away. But you could argue that if there was a law, if you could ever find a law over here that he was saying that other than the Delphic Oracle, then you could argue that, well, he's not under the law, and so Paul can be saved just by faith alone. But the woman is not allowed to be saved by faith alone. She has to obey this law to keep silent in church. That's holiness, right? There it is. She has to continue in faith and charity and holiness. So here's your holiness. You got to be silent in church and with sobriety. So she's got a whole different set of commands. Now, if you think this isn't, this is screwball religion. This is just made up stuff. This is not in God's word. There's not two tiers of man and woman, and one is saved one way and the other is saved another way. This is just craziness. But look at it from a man's point of view. Now, the women have to see it all the time, but men, look at it from your point of view. You have never paid any attention that women have all these extra burdens, right? You've read 1 Timothy 2:15, but you don't care because it's not you. But now you should care, because this is incongruent with God's word. How could you be not under the law and she's under the law, or under principles of justification by faith, charity, holiness, sobriety, and childbearing? She has to be saved by all these things. And you get off with nothing? This doesn't sound like God. This has no equity to it. And her punishment from the, and this is what this Ellicott is saying here, her punishment, your wife's punishment, or all women's punishment to this day, all stems from Genesis 3:16, which doesn't even involve a punishment on her progeny, the children of Eve. It's only on her, just as the Eastern Orthodox Church has said from the very beginning and split on this issue with the Roman Catholic Church. This is not a small issue, and it's a big deal. And you and I have to come to realization as men that somebody is wrong here, and it's not God. And God didn't create any of these things that Paul is saying, and it's a bunch of hooey. Okay, there's no two different gospels. Everybody is saved the same way. Jesus didn't ever say, well, I'm going to talk to the women over here, and you're going to have a different gospel than over here, over the men. The men are going to get this gospel, and no. That's never existed ever in history. Not even in pagan religion do they believe that. This is amazing. Paul made up a completely different religion than has ever existed before. One is set for men of rules and one set for women. The men have no duty other than just believe some facts about Jesus and his death and burial and resurrection. The women have all these other duty to have children and have faith, charity, and holiness and sobriety. It's amazing that we didn't put this together, man. And we need to actually focus on the burdens Paul puts on women, because then we will understand if it's cockamamie stuff like this, it can't be from God. It's inconsistent. God doesn't talk this way ever in his law. This is preposterous amendation of his law, and it makes God look incoherent and basically inconsistent. And it does not justify, it's not justified by anything in Genesis 3:16. As I said, as the Eastern Orthodox have said, it is only a punishment on Eve, not on her progeny, that her husband will rule over her, because that was her problem. She didn't consult with him and didn't, do what a good wife should do, which is to have a discussion, because Jesus says we're one with our wives. They're one flesh. You were you once before that marriage, you then get married, and now you're one flesh. And that means you have to cooperate and work things out by discussion and reasonable discussion and reasonable decisions. And nobody is the boss of the other one. No one is a child or subservient or whatever. You're all adults, and we all have to work it out together. And if we can't work it out together, we just wait it out. We just think more hard about an issue, whatever that might be, with our spouse. Anyway, this is a mind blower, isn't it? Paul clearly contradicts himself, that there is a law about women have to be silent in church, and yet he's not under the law. So women are under the law and he's not under the law. That's contradictory, because humans are all humans, and God never had a law for men and women that are totally different, like a total species of total different obligations, one from the other. That's really unbelievable. And I hope you can take away from this that you need, if you're not yet reevaluating Paul, you need to seriously sit down and look at him. And that's why I decided I'm going to put all this up on the screen so you can see it. You know what? One more thing. I didn't read this completely for you. This is what Ellicott said Paul's meaning here of not being under the law. Not being myself under the law, in contrast to those who were so. The apostle had died to the Mosaic law that he might the more fully live to Christ. So there's absolutely no dispute what he is saying, Paul is saying here, and this is the Greek words that existed, okay, that Paul was saying the law is dead. He died to the Mosaic law, and that's why he is not under God's law. How then, if he's died to the law, why is a woman bound to the law? Okay, so that means he's incoherent. And Ellicott sees these two things here 9 years later. And what's so interesting is he gave up his view from earlier, which was what? What Ellicott said 9 years earlier was that basically the law was abrogated as to the woman also. So that law that would make her subject to Adam under Genesis 3:16, that's in the Torah. Genesis is part of Torah. That's been also abrogated. And therefore, a Christian woman is no more inferior to the man than is the Gentile to the Jew or the bondman to the free. In Christ, the whole penalty that God imposed on people under the law is gone once you've accepted Christ by faith. It has been abrogated, cites Galatians 3:28. So he said that in 1878. He gives it up. By the way, you can find this in Bible Hub. So if you go to Bible Hub, Genesis 3:16, you'll see Ellicott's commentary. Then you can find these words here, okay? So Paul is taking the position earlier, Ellicott's taking the position earlier that there was no law at all on Eve. And then, but when he sees this 9 years later in his commentary on 1 Corinthians, he just backs off and he says, now, all right, there is a law on Eve. Let's go back to that just real quick. So Ellicott back here, he reverses himself. There's no abrogation of the law for Eve. She's still subject to the law. He ignores the fact that he said 9 years earlier the opposite. And so Paul is free of the law, but not Eve, not the women of today. So that he's able to live with this incoherence, this inconsistency, that women are subject to the law, but men aren't. And that's where he leaves it. This is what he's saying to you. I hope you get that, women. God's law still applies to you. Only men are free from God's law. See what the irony of this all is that's what you end up with. And but the truth is, all this is poppycock, meaning Paul is just a complete blunderbuss. He just doesn't. He's not coherent. He doesn't make any sense. He doesn't cite any sources, and he's obviously relying upon pagan principles about women have to be silent in the religious ceremonies in that pagan world. That isn't the way it works in Judaism. I guarantee you. All right. God bless. I hope this helps everybody. It's amazing. Another amazing thing I just stumbled in by accident tonight. So I think it's just a proof positive. You don't even have to be a genius to figure this out. It's just so once you see it with your eyes, you can't unsee it. That's what I keep telling you. And I'm just like you. I experience it just like you. I go, whoa, this is amazing stuff. You can't, and that's why I put it in a way that you can't unsee it. You can see it right in front of your face, right here, right now. This is incontrovertible stuff. Women are saved by childbearing if they continue in faith and charity and holiness and sobriety. I mean, it doesn't get more blunt in your face. God is testing you. And let me just remind you why God does this. He says, I allow false prophets to test you to see whether you love me. This is Deuteronomy 13:1-10. Whether you love me with your whole heart, mind, and soul. And then anybody who tries to turn you away from my law or teach you about a different God than you have known before, basically a God who can be incoherent, inconsistent, is a different God than I think you could ever imagine if you were a Jewish person or if you were anybody who read the Torah or the law and prophets. If there's somebody like that, God says, I'm allowing this to happen to put you under a test to see whether you love me. And the duty you have is to reject that person and not follow and not listen to him at all. That's the challenge of each one of us. And it's a difficult decision, I understand. And you're going to be ostracized by your family and friends, and they're going to think you're, a heretic and all this kind of stuff. It doesn't matter. You follow God. Moses was not. People thought he was crazy. You're trying to lead the people of Israel out of there. Whatever you have to do, you just obey God and you just leave the consequences to God. All right. Take care. God bless. Ciao. Bye.